From Christmas, I woke up and there was an Atari 800 waiting for me under the Christmas tree. So that was very exciting. Back in those days, there were magazines that had games in them that you would type in BASIC. So you'd get a magazine, you'd sit there and just type every line in. It actually was a good way to learn how games work. I also learned that BASIC wasn't fast enough. And so I started to teach myself assembly language. And I didn't really know what I wanted to program. So I just started imitating games that I saw in the arcades, you know, kind of the classics. I did a version of Space War and Frogger. I mean, they weren't classics back then, they were brand new. But so I did this Frogger clone that I called Froggy. It was written in hand assembly language for the Atari 800. There were these things called bulletin boards, and you could dial into a phone number and you could upload a program to the bulletin board, and then other people could dial in and download from there. So my game Froggy kind of spread around the country. Somebody down in California saw it, and it just said Froggy by Eddie Freeze. They tracked it back to me. I was working in a pizza place at the time, and they just showed up one day and said they wanted to hire me to make games for them. So it was very exciting. It was much better than working in a pizza place. So that was how I got into the game business. At this point, Xbox had been approved, and I was in a bit of a panic because I had less than 2 years to pull together a whole portfolio of games for launch. Bungie was kind of in financial trouble, and that they had received an offer from somebody to acquire the company, but they were looking around to see if anyone else might be interested too. We acquired just Team and the Halo intellectual property. We had a lot of games in development, and we didn't really know what was going to be successful at that time. We were working with Steven Spielberg around this big new movie. The movie was going to be a big hit, and we had some games in development around that movie. The movie turned out to be the movie AI. Turns out it wasn't one of Steven Spielberg's biggest hits, so shows it's hard to know what to bet on ahead of time. We were working with Lorne Lanning on the Oddworld series. It was a big coup when we kind of stole him away from Sony to be on our new platform, so that was another big star that we thought we were going to have. And so Bungie just was kind of in the mix. And so about 6 months before we launched, Halo, we did starting to get really fun. And a game that we played a lot at night, a lot of people played around the office. And it was a game that I was using to demo the Xbox. It was the flashiest looking game we had. So I would show off the capabilities of the Xbox. But even at E3 2001, so less than 6 months before launch, we still had half-speed hardware. The graphics chip in particular was running at half speed. So when we showed it at E3, people were pretty underwhelmed. We heard all kinds of crazy things. We heard, you know, it looks like a PC game trying to be a console game, and just the games like this didn't really work on the console, and it kind of showed that we didn't understand the console business and stuff like that. Didn't want to put all our eggs in that basket because, you know, maybe these people were right. Maybe we really didn't know what we were doing in the console business. Maybe Halo was a PC game, but, you know, from our PC game heritage, it looked like a pretty damn good one to us. I was speaking at a game conference, a little game conference back on the East Coast, and I was sharing a cab back to the airport with a guy. We were talking about the old days, and I was talking about programming the Atari 800, and he asked me if I ever programmed the Atari 2600. And I said, no, I don't know anything about the 2600. The 2600 was the console that came out before the 800, and it came out in 1977, so quite a bit earlier, and it was much more primitive. And he said, well, this great book just came out called Racing the Beam. I got the book, and it was great, and I read it, and it was all about the 2600 and what a difficult platform it is to develop on. That just made me curious as a programmer. I drew the little Master Chief sprite, and I put him on the screen. And then I needed an enemy, so I drew an enemy, and I wanted to make him shoot, so I made him shoot the enemy, and then I wanted to make the enemy shoot back. And then by about March, I went to the Game Developers Conference, and I just happened to run into some game collector types, and I mentioned to them that I was playing around with the 2600, and they were kind of like, oh, you gotta do this. It was a fair amount of work, actually. You know, the whole game fits in just 4,000 bytes. It has 64 rooms you battle through, and it's a good thing I did those kinds of games in the old days, because I think it would be hard for someone now to deal with the limitations on that machine. There's only 128 bytes of memory, and only 4,000 bytes for your program. So everything has to be really tight. By about May, I was out of space. I had used up all 4,000 bytes. And squeezing in the last few things, you know, to have room for the title screen. If I was out of bytes, I would shorten the music. And then when I'd find a few more bytes, I could fit in a few more notes of the music again. I was happy with how it turned out. You need to give the player the feeling that they are in control, that they're making meaningful choices. And yet, they're really not. I mean, most of the time, they're really not. You know, if you play Halo and I play Halo, we're all going to run through the same sections of the same levels. Games that tell stories really have to be relatively linear. So the challenge there is to make the player still feel like they're making meaningful choices. There's other games that have really tried to let the player branch out in different ways, and those are legitimate too. You have to fit the story in a different way. So I definitely think telling stories in a game is way harder than telling stories in a movie or in a comic book. An interesting time in the game business. There's less and less big console games being produced right now, which means less big budget, big team kinds of games. And the problem is that games have gotten so beautiful, so complicated, that they've gotten really expensive to make. I mean, I know a couple projects right now that are $100+ million, and that's great. But what's happening is you're just getting a smaller and smaller number of these really, really big budget titles. And so they can't be very risky. They tend to be sequels or sequels of sequels. And so how is there room for the new stuff? And how is there room for the new team to break into that? The reaction to that that's happening on the other side is the indie game scene, which is incredible, and it's really neat to see what's happening there. The mobile space is more hopeful between, you know, Android, which is relatively open, and Apple, which has done a better job of managing their ecosystem so that it's not dominated by a small number of huge companies. There is a lot more potential for innovation, and I think that's something that we're seeing today, and it's one reason you see growth in the number of players there. So there's some cool stuff happening, and there's some scary stuff happening, and it's a time of uncertainty in the business for sure. I love video games because they are an activity that is interactive. I mean, I sort of have to compare it to other things, you know? Like, I like books, I like movies too, but why do I like video games better than those things? It's because I get to be in the story. I get to feel like I'm the main character, and be the hero or fail trying to be the hero, and then you get to try again. So I think it's a more advanced form of entertainment. I think it's a more entertaining form of entertainment. I'd much rather be in the movie and be in control than just watching it. So that's why I like games.